evening to everyone watching. I am pleased to welcome our imaginatives who are joining us today, Hiraya Manawari. Let me begin by greeting you all a happy fiesta and a happy Independence Day. I am Celine Abella and I will be hosting today's program. Our month long celebration has been ongoing for 2 weeks already, and we cannot hide the excitement every time we organize special webinars like this one. We had a grand opening talking about Hiraya Foresight, and then we moved to the topic anticipatory governance, and then we had an exclusive Futures Thinking 101 training for the Department of Education. We also had webinars on the future environment of human interactions. And finally, the very recent, the imagination in post-normal times, which was a conversation with Sia Sardar and Scott Jordan. After a rapid fire online event delivery, the festivities continue because today, my dear Imaginatives, not only do we get to celebrate and commemorate our 123rd Independence Day, but also zoom out and look at our nation and the international arena from the lens of futures and foresight. With this, we bring you the futures of geopolitics. Without further ado, there is no other way to open today's special webinar but to hear a welcome message from our very own Philippine Futures Thinking Society President, Dr. Lizan E. Perante Calina.
Thank you very much, Sinch, for that introduction and updates on what are we doing now when it comes to celebrating our Fiesta of Imagination. Isang magandang umaga sa inyo lahat. Marami po tayong participants coming from Visayas, Mindanao, Luzon, and also from different parts of the world. So today marks the 123rd Independence Day of the Philippines, and likewise, we are celebrating our Fiesta of Imagination. And today's topic is very interesting, and we are all excited to listen to all our experts because geopolitics is one of the key areas in governance. And according to the World Economic Forum, there are facets that we need to look into, like technological competition, environmental dangers, populism and nationalism, economic shifts, strained institutions and alliance, multipolar and multi-conceptual. So these are concepts that I guess our experts will also touch and give or shed light into these areas. And with this, geopolitics has really evolved since the end of the Cold War. There are shifts in the economic growth, dominance and leadership, issues on traditional foreign policies, and political values. Thus, today we will delve into the features of geopolitics with our experts on the field. And I will not introduce them because I'll give that to our moderator and to our host. But I'd just like to emphasize that this is in collaboration with the Philippine Society for Public Administration, DAP Graduate School of Public and Development Management, and special thanks to the International Development and Security headed by Dr. Chester Cabalsa, who really arranged this one and facilitated the coming up together of our experts. So without much further ado, I'd like to encourage you to enjoy the conversation, be active. You can chat in our chat box your insights and perspectives. So maraming salamat, Hiraya Manawari. Maligayang araw ng kalayaan sa lahat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lizan. I am sure you are thrilled by that opening message by our president. And we do have a lot of our experts lined up for today. So at this juncture, we will now move forward to the presentation and discussions. To moderate the polylogue, I am pleased to welcome Mr. Don McLean Hill. Mr. Hill is a resident fellow at the International Development and Security Cooperation and Director for the South and Southeast Asia Committee of PMESA. He specializes in regional politics and Indian foreign policy and have written for major peer-reviewed international journals, book projects, and publications. May I now call on to the virtual floor Mr. Don McLean Hill to facilitate the polylogue.
Thank you very much, Ms. Abelia. Thank you, Dr. Lizan, for the kind invitation. And of course, a happy Independence Day. There's no better way to celebrate this significant occasion with a discussion of the future of geopolitics, especially in the context of the Philippines. Now, as we can see, the concept of geopolitics is quite controversial to the extent that it is always either deepening or broadening in terms of its theoretical background. Now, if I may kindly introduce our distinguished panelists, I would like to start. Dr. Chester Cabalza is the founder and president of the Manila based think tank International Development and Security Cooperation, and formerly the vice president for research and strategic studies and the executive fellow at the Development Academy of the Philippines. He was appointed as associate professor, past registrar, and head of public and information office at the National Defense College of the Philippines. He also teaches in the graduate school at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He is conferred by the Department of Science and Technology as scientist under the Presidential Decree 997. He was formerly a consultant at the Japan International Cooperation Agency. He is a fellow of the People's Liberation Army at the National Defense University in Beijing, China, and the United States State Department under the stewardship of the University of Delaware. Now, Mr. Lucio Blanco Pitlo III is a research fellow at the Asia Pacific Pathways to Progress Foundation. He is also a member of the board of directors of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies. He was a lecturer at the Chinese Studies program at the Ateneo de Manila University and the International Studies Department at De La Salle University. He had been a research assistant for various projects on maritime issues and Philippine foreign policy, and has also worked for the National Coast Watch Council Secretariat. He was a participant in numerous local and regional academic and Track 1.5 and 2 discussions on geopolitics, security, and connectivity issues, subjects he has also regularly written about. He obtained his Master's of Law from Peking University and is presently pursuing his Master's in International Affairs at the American University in Washington, D.C. Now, for our third speaker, we have Dr. Robin Michael Yu Garcia. He is a Shanghai educated political scientist, academic, and CEO of WRN Research, a data analytic and public opinion research firm in collaboration with WNR Political Risk Analysis firm founded in 2017. He is currently an assistant professor at the Political Economy program of the School of Law and Governance at the University of Asia and the Pacific. He has written on topics that lie at the intersection of political psychology, international political economy, and international relations theory applied to Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and China. Professor Garcia has lectured on development theory, political economy, public policy, and international relations at De La Salle University in Manila and the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Dr. Garcia has been invited to deliver keynote addresses at the British Chamber of Commerce, Myanmar, the Mongolian Ministry of Food and Agriculture, Consular Corps of the Philippines, the Rotary Club of Makati West, and of course, Doing Business in Asia Alliance annual meetings, the University of the Philippines, Diliman, Ateneo de Manila University, the Department of Interior and Local Government, the Peace Summit, among others. He has also appeared in the National Interest, Eurasia Review, Rappler, CNN, Bloomberg Mongolia, Analyzing War, South China Morning Post, Business World, among others. He has advised top government leaders, diplomats, multinational companies on political economic development in the Philippines. At just 27 years of age, he had obtained a Doctor of Philosophy in Politics and International Relations degree from the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University in Shanghai, where he was distinguished with the Dean's Award for Academic Excellence in 2017. He also holds a Master's of Public Administration, major in Public Policy from the University of the Philippines National College of Public Administration and Governance. In 2013, that is in 2013, as well as a BA in Development Studies from De La Salle University in 2010, where he was awarded the Gawad Mag-aaral Award. Now, for our fourth speaker, I'm glad to introduce Dr. Aaron Jed Rabena, who is a research fellow at the Asia Pacific Pathways to Progress. He's an adjunct fellow at the University of the Philippines Korea Research Center and a member of the Philippine Council for Foreign Relations. He previously served as senior lecturer at the Asian Center in the University of the Philippines Diliman and a visiting fellow at the China Institute of International Studies and China Foreign Affairs University. He's likewise a Pacific Forum Young Leader and is an alumnus of the East West Center and the U.S. State Department's International Visitor Leadership Program. He also holds a PhD in International Relations from Shandong University in the People's Republic of China. His areas of interest include strategic studies, East Asian geopolitics, multilateral politics, political risk, Chinese politics, and foreign policy. Now, with that, we have a clear picture of who we are going to hear from, and such a distinguished panel is definitely worth listening to, and it's very exciting to be here today. Now, on to the topic at hand. The geopolitical landscape is undergoing significant changes given the massive shift in the global distribution of power, the devastating effects of the COVID 19 pandemic, the fast paced development of technology, and the increasing importance of middle powers in international politics. Now, looking at it from the systemic level or the structural level, the international system is currently being defined by the overarching power competition between two great powers, or as we call the great power competition between the United States and China. Now, US China relations are seen to be at an all time low due to mistrust and animosity between both sides. Now, there have been ideas being thrown around that we are entering a second Cold War. Whether or not it is true is subject for further investigation. Moreover, as I've mentioned, the broadening of the scope of geopolitics and not only its deepening is also something that needs further inquiry and investigation. Now, with all this in mind, I wish to now turn to our distinguished panelists to ask broadly about what the drivers behind these trends are. In fact, how can middle powers such as the Philippines play a bigger role in the picture? And how do domestic factors alter foreign policy trajectories? And of course, what do all these things mean for the future of geopolitics? Now, I would like to first turn to Mr. Pitlo. Could you please provide us with your take on what you think are the factors that are driving the power competition between the US and China? How is the US addressing China's rise in the context of its allies and strategic partners? Mr. Pitlo, I give the floor to you for this.
Thank you, Don, for the very generous introduction. Before I start, I would like again to express my deepest gratitude to the organizers for inviting me this morning to share my thoughts and my views about the topic assigned to me. Maligayang araw ng kasanilan. Good morning and happy Independence Day to everyone. So this morning, what I would do is to share my personal insights on the future of geopolitics with a particular emphasis on the fate of the US alliances in Asia. So allow me to share my screen. I prepared a very short presentation just to have some guide on how I would proceed with my talk. Can you guys see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So as Don correctly mentioned earlier, the lay of the land. So there's massive changes in the regional and global power distribution. Of course, the coronavirus pandemic, already in its second year, continues to be unpredictable with new strains, more contagious and more lethal still emerging. And countries that initially proclaimed prematurely victory or triumph over the pandemic have suffered resurgence. And in Southeast Asia alone, we have also seen uh, this unfortunate rise in cases in recent weeks and months. And so while science is catching up with the coronavirus pandemic, there is still a lot of unknowns about this virus, about how it mutates, and of course, what measures are best to cope up with this unprecedented global health crisis. And so, also in recent weeks, we have also seen calls of other countries to really go into the bottom of the virus, the genesis, the origins of the coronavirus, and of course, that also affected relations between major powers and that of China, with U.S., Australia, and other countries um, calling on China to be more forthcoming, more transparent, and more open, more cooperative in really getting into the bottom of the issue about whether there was mishandling, and of course ways forward for the world on how to deal with the emergence of unknown epidemics new to science, going forward. And of course, the pandemic also affected the economic performance of many countries. The Philippines, for instance, suffered one of our deepest economic contractions since World War II. I think it stopped 3 decades of continued economic growth. And so this leadership's legacy would be, of course, affected by how it would be able to turn things around given the limited time it has before handing over power to the next leadership. And the next leadership would also have to make really good investments on economic stimulus, to help the economy recover from this recession. And of course, this is not endemic to us. The region, the world had suffered enough, and the race for economic recovery would also uh, spell the power differentials, among countries in the region and major countries in the world, especially those who are competing for hierarchy. And these twin challenges of the shifts in global power distribution, the impact of the pandemic to it, and the race to economic recovery. All of this cumulatively compel many small and middle powers to um, apply, adopt various modes of hedging strategies. The idea being is to avoid being beholden to one major or limited set of partners. So try to diversify. I think the challenge here is not only the numbers of partnerships, but the quality and the degree of the the value and effectiveness of these partnerships, whether it's in the economic or in the security realm. And of course, the great power competition would be a key defining feature of international relations going forward. And we have seen US and China competing across the board in almost all domains from A to Z. So trade, technology, supply chains, and security. And in the Indo-Pacific, of course, there's a lot of flashpoints where these two titans are into opposite uh, standpoints, whether that's in the South or East China Seas or on the issue of Taiwan. But more importantly, I think the competition overall, the major, not the existential issue, is really the writing of the rules of the road, from governance of trade to security. I think the challenge posed by the rise of China to the US is whether there's a need to how to maintain the order that was led and championed by the US since the post-war amidst the rising challenge of resurgent China. And of course, norms or standard setting from infrastructure investment, to the fields of cyber and space. These cutting-edge technologies there would be very heated and difficult conversations on these issues. And the recent U.S. Alaska summit, of course, displayed this acrimony between these two titans. Now, uh, next month would be a very also ominous period. I put here a tale of two Julys. Of course, we know we are very familiar with the 4th of July. So I think it's a Philippine American Independence Day, Philippine American Friendship Day, and it's also U.S. Independence Day. And it's likely that U.S. will try to use this occasion to celebrate victory over the pandemic, given the pace by which they're rolling out the vaccines, and of course, revitalizing the alliances. Of course, under the Biden administration, there's a lot of investment in revitalizing reshoring alliances that were undercut by the previous Trump administration. And of course, it's day one. President Joe Biden had said America is back. But of course, um, in on the part of China, a near competitor, not a very close competitor to U.S. Uh, China would be celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the Communist Party of China, and so that would, of course, display uh, the credentials, of course, of the ability of the party to turn an agrarian, poor, backward country to uh, to now the second largest economy in the world. And many forecasts said that they may overtake the US in terms of the economy, at least in the few years to come. And so that is a major announcement of the entry of China in this field. And in early June, we have heard President Xi Jinping in one of the study sessions of the Communist Party of China uh, announce a new marching order, which is to strive to create a credible, lovable, and respectable image of China. Again, this would be a very serious challenge, given the backlash received by, this very combative, this very assertive wolf warrior diplomacy that was pursued by Chinese diplomats and officials in recent years. That triggered a lot of backlash, especially from the West. Now, given all of this, how does U.S. In my view, U.S. grand strategy would look like? So I think the contours of that strategy would revolve around several features. First, of course, there's a focus on great power competition and democratic renewal, both at home and abroad. And alliances and partnerships will be very important in that overall scheme, in that strategy. Now, in the pursuit of such a strategy, there would be a very difficult balancing act that U.S. has to undertake between promoting human rights. Of course, there's domestic pressure, huge domestic pressure, and of course, there's huge international expectation for the U.S. to stick to these values, to stay to its values, while expanding and keeping its enduring alliances and partnerships. And that would not be an easy feat. Of course, considering the rise of illiberal regimes and governments, not only in Southeast Asia, but elsewhere also. And it appears that U.S. in recent years, even under the Biden administration, appears to be investing more towards minilaterals and putting a lot of emphasis on Quad, for instance. Of course, the Quad being a club of major and middle powers that includes India, Japan, Australia, and the U.S. Um, Japan, Australia, and U.S. are tied, part of the hub and spoke system. India is traditionally a non-aligned, but it's growing closer to U.S. and to the other Quad countries, not least because of actions being taken by China along their border in the Himalayas and trade and other related issues with China. And so this Quad is a form of a minilateral framework, and it's being seen as a way to push forward when there seems to be some very difficult and very slow pace uh, for reforms or taking actions in more long-standing organizations. So for instance, in this case, the ASEAN. There's a lot of frustration, for instance, with ASEAN on how the crisis in Myanmar is being handled. And of course, the Quad is looking at the situation. US had expressed, of course, dismay about the continuing violence. And so this puts a lot of onus on Philippines and the rest of ASEAN to really step up, um, given this um, features of the US grand strategy. Now, in terms of the issues in the alliance and partnership management, I identified a few points. The first one is equitable burden sharing. And of course, this has been raised in America's relations with Japan and South Korea. I think this administration, the Duterte administration of the Philippines, had also expressed concerns about the burden sharing. And so I think this issue going forward would remain a thorny subject between US and junior allies, especially in the Asia Pacific. The issue of non-alignment and the growing risk aversion. So, of course, the rise of China being closer to Asian allies of the US, um, that represents greater risk on their part. And so some of them would raise this in their engagement with the US. Of course, we don't know how it would be factored. This heightened security risk. Of course, in I think around 2017, South Korea had allowed US to install THAAD missiles, and that really affected uh, China-South Korea relations. And tourism and investments of South Korea in China was severely adversely affected. And so that was very telling, considering China is now the major trade partner for almost all Asian countries. And so that power asymmetry in terms of trade, China can really put to bear many resources and can pull many strings, to really express their displeasure. And so this kind of this greater sense of risk would of course compel many countries in the region to really candidly and frankly raise these issues with their longtime allies. And the issue of the US coming into the not only the Philippines but also other countries in the region, including islands in the Pacific, they're trying to secure bases, forward bases, access to get closer to, of course, try to prevent China from expanding to the West Pacific. And so this would bring in conversations about to what extent US would go to secure such access. And of course, I mentioned earlier about the concern in Southeast Asia about the rise of authoritarian or increasingly illiberal allies and partners, and to what extent US will tolerate that so long as they can get access to whether agreed locations under EDCA or maybe some locations in Vietnam or in Malaysia or in Indonesia or islands in the South Pacific. So these are issues that would affect America's alliance and partnership management. And of course, the long-running historical issues would continue to play out. Japan and South Korea, both U.S. allies, still have lingering issues. The U.S. of course did its best to try to mediate between the two, but I think this issue would continue to challenge relations between these close neighbors and allies. And then finally, I think, of course, with the leadership change impending in the Philippines in less than a year, the impact of this leadership transition to long-standing, military pacts or mutual defense treaties, they would affect the management of alliances and partnerships on the part of the US. So I would end there, and hopefully we can have more engaging conversation during the Q&A. Thank you, Don, and thank you to the organizers. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pitlo, for such a comprehensive and concise discussion on the overview the power competition between the US and China, the limitations, and of course, the implications on China per se. Now, speaking on the implications, Dr. Rabena, considering that this competition, this power competition, is bound to take place in a long-term time frame, how do you think China's long-term and future strategy would play out, given the highly competitive dynamics of the geopolitical landscape that it is currently facing in the international system? The floor is yours, sir. Dr. Rabena?
Oops, sorry. Yeah. Well done. Can you hear me? Is it?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Sorry about that. I thought I was the. Sorry, I thought it was the last speaker. My audio is good. Okay, but
It's good, sir. Yeah.
okay. Sorry about that. So, thank you, Don, for the introduction a while ago, and to all the other organizers. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great delight to be here. Dr. Kalina, Mr. Sherman, Mr. Marcus, to my friends and co-panelists, Sir Chester, Robin, Lucio, and to everyone. A very good morning and a happy Independence Day. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, but I hope you don't mind me just delivering my remarks. So I was asked to talk about the country that has always been the talk of the town and will be so for decades to come, and that is China. So to know China's blueprint for the future, I think it is vital to know the role of history in China's strategic culture. As many of you already well know, it was Napoleon who said that China is a sleeping giant. Let her sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world. Now, with China's continued rise, it can be felt in all facets of policy issue areas how China is shaking the world. And it is because of China's rise and the disruptions that it is causing that it has been tagged as a revisionist power, or what one scholar says is China's behavioral shift from being a norm taker to a norm shaper. China causing shocks to the world is evident as it spearheads international regimes like the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Efforts meant to increase Chinese influence, deepen interdependence or entanglement with relevant states, and provide international public goods. We can also see China's growing convening power in its hosting of major sporting events like the 2008 Olympics. And in fact, next year, China is set to host the 2022 Winter Olympics. China also hosts key diplomatic events such as the Boao Forum for Asia, which is touted as the Asia's version of the World Economic Forum in Davos. They also have the World Political Dialogue, South-South Human Rights Forum, World Internet Conference, and Conference on Dialogue of Asian Civilizations, and also the World Cyber Conference. All these manifest that China is maximizing its agenda-setting powers. Apart from these, there is also the rise of corporate China. As of 2020, for the first time in history, there's already more Chinese than American companies in the Fortune 500. Also, as of 2020, 4 out of the top 5 global unicorns are based in China. According to Bloomberg, owing to the relative response of China and the US to the COVID-19 pandemic, China will likely overtake the US as the world's largest economy earlier than predicted, which is 2028. Against this backdrop, some scholars believe that China is not rising, but only re-rising. This is because since the first century, China has already been the world's largest economy, together with India, where it held around 30% of the global economy. In this regard, I think it is important to take into account 2 major assumptions. First, like the United States, China has a great power mentality, or what I'd say the Middle Kingdom complex, where they believe historically that their culture or civilization is more advanced vis-a-vis other countries. And I would say this is no different from the United States' great power mentality, where it sees itself as the city upon a hill and harbors ideals in the guise of the manifest destiny and American exceptionalism. Second, like South Korea, China has a victim mentality and remembers the past. And this is what we can call China's never again moment, or the so called century of humiliation, 1839 1949, which started with the Opium Wars up to the Second World War. But unlike China, South Korea has no great power mentality. While some might say that President Xi is the one that unleashed China to become more overly ambitious, I tend to believe that China's domestic agenda has been consistent ever since and has been decades in the making. Mao Zedong himself wanted an industrialized China through his policy of the Great Leap Forward, which aimed to rapidly put China along the ranks of economically advanced Western countries, and he called it to catch up with England and surpass the USA. And it is just that his policy choice for doing this was wrong. Come Deng Xiaoping, there was the invigorate China policy, where he stirred consciousness on the need to develop China's comprehensive national power. In doing this, he popularized the phrase, observe sober-mindedly, secure our position, cope with affairs calmly, and attain some achievement. Or this is the also known as the famous hide one's capacities and bide one's time. Under Jiang Zemin, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation was officially mentioned, which actually has its roots in Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Republic of China. Foreign policy-wise, this was when China started to become vocal about calling for a multipolar world. Under Hu Jintao, he bannered what is called proactively attaining achievement, meaning that China should do more on the world stage. And now, under President Xi, there is the major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics and striving for achievements. This was made no clearer by him when he declared in 2018 that China must lead the reform of global governance. It was likewise President Xi himself who said that the Chinese nation has stood up, grown rich, and become strong, and that the new era will be an era that sees China moving closer to center stage and making greater contributions to mankind. Under President Xi, there is also the vision of the Chinese dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And this is basically China's way of saying that they want to be number one. To achieve this, they have selected two centenary goals, referring to the party and state centenaries. The first centenary goal, 2021, is to become a moderately prosperous society, meaning the doubling of their 2010 GDP. They also have a midterm goal, that is by 2035, where they aim to become a fundamentally modern socialist country. And of course, the second centenary goal, in that by 2049, they should be a great modern socialist country or a developed country. In addition, President Xi underscored that China should be a mighty force on political, economic, military, and environmental issues and become a respected scientific and technological power. In view of this, it may thus be inferred that the specific goals under China's comprehensive national power are the following. Militarily, China aims to become a modernized power by 2035 and a world-class military by 2050. Economically, there is the Made in China 2025 program, where the goal is to become 70% self-sufficient in 10 core technologies by 2025. In terms of science and technology, China aims to be a world leader in science and innovation by 2050. But in terms of AI and nuclear power production, they aim to do so by 2030. China also wants to be a leading space power by 2045. To date, China now has more Scopus published AI articles and patent applications than the United States. In the cyber domain, China aims to become a leading cyber power by 2035. And environmentally, China aims to become a carbon neutral country by 2060. In conclusion, uh, I think it is clear that China wants status, prestige, and achieve national rejuvenation. China has recognized that with great power and interests comes great responsibility. And as China's strength grows, so will its resolve in constructing its national interests and in defending its core interests. Given this, I think China's trajectory will depend on two major factors: China's vision and ambitions, and the US factor, because the Chinese have always been paranoid about US actions as they think that they are being contained. Moreover, US inactions or troubles at home may also embolden China to be more assertive on the global stage. And so, in this regard, I think it is important for us to be cognizant of the China US action reaction dynamics, as these would have profound implications for the global and regional environment. So, I will end my remarks here and look forward to your hearing your comments and questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bena, for providing us with an enlightening outline of China's future strategy by taking us back to history, which I believe is very important in outlining its strategic culture, of course, and its future trajectory as a rising great power. Now, going beyond the systemic outlook of the great power competition, it is debatable to say that the 21st century geopolitical outlook goes beyond the roles of great powers and towards other important actors in the system. So, middle powers have arguably been stepping into the limelight of international political discourse. Now, Dr. Cabalza, what do you think are the roles of middle powers, such as the Philippines in particular, in the context of this geopolitical dynamics? In addition, what does this say about the future of global geopolitics? I wish to give the floor to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Don, for your kind introduction earlier. First, I would like to thank the organizers, first to Dr. Lizan Kalina for inviting us together with some of my friends and colleagues, Lucio, Jed, Robin, and Don. Today, I'm going to discuss about the role of the Philippines as a middle power. And this is, we know for a fact that the Philippines is one of the most controversial countries in Southeast Asia. And some are arguing whether or not the Philippines is considered as a middle power. So I'll share with you my slides to show some of the indicators that the Philippines has arrived as a middle power. And these are some of the indicators that we will be discussing later on. Okay, I'd like to probe some question first before I go on with my discussion about the future role of the Philippines as a middle power, and what are the indicators that the Philippines has achieved the middle power status, and how does a middle power behave and think, and what are the future roles of the Philippines as a middle power. Those are some of the questions that I would like to pose beforehand, but these are some of the indicators why the Philippines is considered as a middle power. Let's talk about the fast facts first. Well, according to my colleague at IDSC, Joshua Espina, he said that all the sum of would argue that Manila cannot be qualified as a middle power due to its reluctance to be called one. The Lowly Institute's Asia Power Indices from 2018 to 2020 ranked the Philippines as a middle power, but it was placed the second lowest before North Korea with diplomatic influence and defense network as the highest indicator. Now, with the rapid population growth in the Philippines up to 2030, will be driven by positive natural changes as net migration remains negative, meaning to say that while we will see aging trend in the Philippines with the surging growth of the 60 plus cohorts, this will be from a low base, but the Philippines will remain a young population with 70% remaining over 40 years or below in 2030. And meaning to say that the urban population will expand quickly because we will have smart cities, mega cities in the Philippines also with rapid growth in major cities. And the Philippines will or is poised to become the 18th largest economy in the world by 2050. And as long as it addresses its infrastructure lack, which the incumbent government is doing right now because of its build up program, according to the London-based macroeconomic research organization Capital Economics. And the Philippines is projected to have a nominal GDP to 4.8 trillion 3 decades from now. And that means that we will have a GDP per capita that would rise to 36,650. So imagine it will triple the current nominal GDP that we have right now. And we know for a fact that in 2019, there was a restraint in the development because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the Philippines right now is currently ranked as the 30th largest economy in the world. Now, the third tranche of the AFP modernization program will end by 2028. That means that we will have at least a respected, robust defense posture by 2030. So meaning to say that we will be like Indonesia and Vietnam by the time already. And for sure, even if China will try to bully us, at least we can defend our sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, the Philippines, we know for a fact, is a co-founder of the United Nations, and uh, it was committed. Of course, the Philippines committed to maintain international peace and security after the Second World War, and the Philippines is also regarded as one of the founding members of the ASEAN. And aside from its participation in multilateral and minilateral initiatives, Manila also houses the Asian Development Bank, aimed to foster economic cooperation and growth in Asia. And the Philippines also develops rice varieties and stocks all of its kinds found in the planet through the International Rice Research Institute, or the IRI. And we know for a fact that there was a time in its history when IRI plays a very important role because of the famine in India, and IRI realized its mandate when it preempted famine in India on the same period when the world summoned a call for the Green Revolution movement in 1960s. And also Manila is known to have a reputation for giving credible awards to distinguished Asians who excel in their body of works on government service, public service, community leadership, peace and international understanding, and journalism, literature, communication arts, rendered by the Ramon Magsaysay Awards in its annual award-giving tradition since 1957, equivalent to the prestigious Nobel Peace Prize. Now, the Philippines is also known for its boxing legend and beauty queens, and it is home to four of the largest malls in the planet. These shopping mecca are the SM City North EDSA, SM Mega Mall, SM City Seaside Cebu, SM Mall of Asia, ranked in 2021 as the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 13th largest malls in the world. And a satellite SM Mall in Tianjin, the largest in China, and the third in the world. Now, Manila's economic buoyancy started to strike upward since the second decade of the 21st century, making it the third biggest economy by nominal GDP in Southeast Asia, currently ranked as the 13th leading economy in Asia and the 29th largest in the world. And if that projection will happen by 2050, we will become the second largest economy in Southeast Asia, the fifth economic leader in Asia, and the 18th richest economy in the world. That is by 2050, by projection, by many of our economies. Now, um, let's try to talk about the concept on middle power, because basically some scholars and other practitioners are not yet convinced that the Philippines is a middle power already, when in fact it is. Now, when we discuss about the middle power, it could imbibe an idea of the relative position of a subject in ordinal value. And in general, the middle powers are sensitive to the Olympian style of great power parties, politics as systemic threats, and the incentives are constrained. And accordingly, this is a political entity that has force and authority sufficient to maintain itself without the need of help of another. And to qualify as a middle power, a state must have a friendly disposition with its neighboring powers, but it should carry enough capacity to defend itself. And the absence of a superpower in the post-Cold War would certainly stimulate a new feature in the international system. Thus, this paved way for the middle powers, just like the Philippines, to stride on a new style of foreign relations called niche diplomacy that allowed it to step up and fill the leadership vacuum on various social and economic issues at the global scale. Now, adding more to that concept and debate on the middle power, there's this traditional and emerging middle power. Where is the Philippines there? And yeah, for sure, it is an emerging middle power. And the traditional middle powers refer to states that are wealthy, egalitarian, social democratic, and not regionally influential. And it could be considered that Australia and Japan could be considered as traditional middle powers, and perhaps, of course, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines are the emerging middle powers. And of course, the weak and ambivalent regional orientation, constructing identities distinct from the great powers, and it offer appeasing concessions pressures from global reform. And a middle power could be understood as a state when it cannot protect, or when it can protect its core interests and initiate a change in a specific aspect of that existing international order. Now, the middle power role works best in the ambiguity of great power politics. That great powers are neither too hostile or cooperative. Nevertheless, the middle powers recognize need for a regional order that reflects its strong national interest. So it is important that national interest should be protected to become a strong middle power. Now, let's move to the next slide. Now, let's try to configure what would be the future landscape of security in this region, and to underscore for us to underscore the future role of the Philippines as a middle power to better construe the future security environment. And we know for a fact, as discussed already by Lucio and Jed, about the increasing great power competition between the United States and China, both using contrasting grand strategies in the Indo-Pacific region, will lead to the rise of middle powers, uh, we have seen recently in Southeast Asia. And in spirit, Southeast Asia has become the new theatrical stage of power hegemony, just like the Symphony of the Concert of Power or the Concert of Europe in 1815, with decibels of sounds of the New Cold War. That despite the perceived age of hegemonic transition of the New Cold War, they definitely there will be a contributing um, change and continuity in the global order and the impacting of the US grand strategy. And China is a new challenger, but it will challenge not only the US but the West in its global liberal order alliances and democratic ideals. Now, apparently, seen in the economic overcoat would be the Belt Road Initiative presented by China, and this would unleash China's new level of aggressive confidence that would weaken the ASEAN centrality and will create rules-based order in socializing great and middle powers in the region to multilateral and military minilateral frameworks. But the West, some of our friends from Europe are saying that it's ready the death of multilateralism, and so we will see the draconian presence of China. And definitely, this will not, whether or not this will work in addressing the maritime common problems with the Chinese efforts to defy the US and overthrow it from its fortress. Now, what would happen to the Philippines? Some prospects, perhaps, as a middle power. What actions will the Philippines do if it becomes an upper middle class in future? Now, we know for a fact that there is the impending fear factor that Beijing is posing to us through its Coast Guard law, and it reintroduced the complexity of the regional order after the heated ratification of its China Coast Guard law in February. And this would definitely gave an alarm to a lot of our friends in the Quad and some other um, alliances. And the Manila's lack of foresight to institutionalize a national territorial defense framework as a strategic option in post-Duterte may address lapses in policymaking based from evolving global security landscape and unlike national security policies that we have arrived already from 2000 to present. And the Philippines' pivotal role in the South China Sea's continuing saga scrolls a strategic importance between the two competing argonauts in the region. That's why there is a need for a full of alliance approach and confidence building mechanism that the Philippines must hold on and adamantly consider. And if China will hold a better position in the post 2022 elections in the Philippines, and I think Robin will discuss that later on, my prognosis is that Manila may become as a new hub of the Belt Road Initiative of the Philippines as it aspires to become an upper middle class economy after the COVID-19 pandemic. So I hope that you will ask questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cabalza, for providing a good and absolutely credible conceptual framework for understanding what falls under the gamut of a middle power. And providing this in the context of the Philippines is absolutely critical for us to understand the changing concepts in the geopolitical landscape and, of course, the rise and fall of powers in the international system. So that not only includes great powers, but of course, middle powers as well. Now, speaking of changes, change in international affairs need not only be characterized by the structural or systemic shifts that we are seeing. In fact, Dr. Cabalza has provided that unit or domestic level alterations can significantly modify the foreign policy trajectory of states, such as the Philippines, which in turn affects interstate engagements in both regional and global levels. Now, Dr. Garcia, knowing that election season in the Philippines is just around the corner, what is in store for the future of Philippine foreign policy? The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Don. And thank you as well to the Philippine Futures Thinking Society for organizing this. And congratulations on your first founding anniversary. I'd also like to greet my other panelists, my friends, Dr. Chester, who invited us here, as well as Dr. Lizan and Professor Sherman Cruz and Mr. Marcos Barber for this. No, I'd like to greet you as well. So I'm here to talk about the elections and public opinion research that we've done regarding China and regarding Philippine-China relations as well. So we know that elections can change the course of public policy, and that includes the course of foreign policy as well. And public opinion is a window to analyze the outcome of the elections. But more importantly, public opinion is also a way to analyze the future of foreign policy. And this is so because of several things. One, and I think this is the main mechanism that enable public opinion to influence foreign policy is that in international relations, there's a concept of audience costs. So that means that the public may punish or reward leaders for their foreign policy decisions, and therefore leaders can respond to these public opinion signals that they may use for elections or they may use for their foreign policy trajectory. And I think this concept becomes more important as we enter the election season. In fact, it's just literally less than 12 months to election. On May 9, 2022 is the presidential and national elections in the Philippines. The filing of candidacy is in October, so that's literally just maybe 3 to 4 months from now. So public opinion, at the very least, can create has an agenda setting role, if not may change the course of foreign policy itself. So that's why it's very important to look at that. So let me just share my screen and cast your attention to some of the results that we've done last year at the firm. I mean, it says in the program that I'm the CEO and founder of WR Numeral Research. But more importantly, we've done an intervention into public opinion research. We used a mobile app-based survey because of the pandemic. And we also used social listening and sentiment analytics methodologies to inquire about what people think. It's quite special because, I mean, I don't want to get into the methodological issues, but it's quite special because, I mean, very, very few firms do this. But anyway, so the first part will be about what Filipinos think about China. The second part will be about what Filipinos think about Philippine-China relations, right? And so this is where it might be quite exciting for everyone. So we ran a survey last year from April 27 to 29. That was at the height of the pandemic. And we probed two questions. Firstly, one, whether or not Filipinos think is a good ally to the Philippines, and the second, on whether or not China is a threat to the Philippines. So the result, as you can see in the screen, Filipinos think that China is a good ally to the Philippines, at least 54%. Still a sizable amount, 46% do not agree with that. But on the other hand, Filipinos think that China is a serious threat. 46% believe that, while 36% believe that China is a threat. So combine that, that's a lot of people who think that China is a threat. So how do you reconcile these two results? So the argument that we usually make is that Filipinos believe that China, so Filipinos have what we call instrumental political support instead of moral political support. So that means that because China is perceived to be giving some material benefits to the Philippines, that the Filipinos are, willing maybe to agree that the alliance with China is might be useful, instead of the fact that China has some moral standing in Filipino society. So this is something that we see consistently in our results. But more importantly, what we'd say is that Filipinos have sort of a suspicion, against China as a country, and against China as a government, also the government of China. So that's why the results overwhelmingly say that most Filipinos believe that China is a threat or a serious threat. But at the same time, Filipinos believe that the potential and real material benefits that the Philippines has accrued may give China the status of being a good ally, right? On the other hand, we also probed how the assistance of the Chinese government on COVID-19, how Filipinos thought about the assistance. So I think during that time, it was there were a lot of, in 2020 in April, there were a lot of assistance, like sending the doctors, face mask diplomacy, of course, was there. So, I mean, 58% of the people were happy about that. And I think because of the Filipino desperation of how to solve this pandemic, I think during that time we were really just, surprised that also we were just realizing how much of a problem COVID-19 is, how much of a threat it is to our individual and familiar survival. So we think that that's why 58% of the Filipinos, at least during this period, thought that the COVID assistance of China to the Philippines is satisfactory, or they're happy about it. I mean, of course, there are a lot of research that we can still do. We can unpack this by asking other questions. Maybe in the future, we can ask more questions regarding this topic, and it shouldn't just be a dichotomous happy or unhappy, right? But during that time, I think this was the results are quite revealing of what people thought. So, but at the same time, many people condemn China for the spread of COVID, right? So 64% agree that China should be blamed uh, for spreading COVID-19. And I think this is a perception of so many countries around the world. And I feel that this is heightened because of the media and because of the proximity that we have with China. Regarding Philippine-China relations, and I think this is going to the meat of the elections, right? So we asked whether they agree with President Duterte continuing the close relationship with China. 42% of the people disagree, and I think this is quite low considering many factors. But public opinion is also affected not just by the public diplomacy efforts of China, but also the public diplomacy efforts of the Duterte government. And we know that President Duterte is quite good in, especially with his populism and all his rhetoric. So that also affected the perceptions of people. We also asked whether the president should disregard the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling in favor of the Philippines over the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea dispute. A lot of the people said that they do not agree that the Philippines should disregard it, and they disagree with the president, saying that it should not be, part of the conversation when we deal with China, right? And we also asked the current state of the Philippine-China relations, whether it should be continued beyond the president's term. And we know that there is a political group that is trying to rally Filipinos behind the idea of sovereignty. We know that that's Isambayan, and in fact, they actually have an event. And because it's led by a lot of by some of the most vocal critics of Philippine foreign policy the last 2 years or 3 years rather. So we asked them whether we should continue, and the answer, of course, is they disagree. But some of the people still agree that it should continue. So I think it's because of the framing as well of the president. We know that the president, during the time of the pandemic, held numerous public speeches regarding China, regarding how much friendship we have with China, and how good the Chinese government was and is to the Filipinos. So that sort of also touched on the voter base or the support base of the president, and we feel that that's why 1/3 of the people we asked here agree that beyond the term of President Duterte, we should still continue what we're doing now, right? But I think this result also, might be a word of caution to those who are running for president, that the South China Sea may not be a huge issue. It may not be an electoral issue. But what I always say is that China is an election issue, because China is a multifaceted issue that goes beyond territories, that goes beyond land and disputes in the waters. COVID-19 may actually also be a foreign policy issue, right? Because so many people believe that because we did not act fast, and especially when we closed, the advocacy to close the borders because of the COVID-19 pandemic early on, it could be a foreign policy issue as well because of Philippine friendship with China, at least the Philippine government. And then we also asked about whether China should pay for the damages the countries and the Philippines incurred during the COVID-19. Of course, a lot of the budget realignments in the Philippine government for 2020 and for 2021 definitely went into COVID-19 response. So there were a lot of costs incurred by the Philippines, and there were a lot of costs incurred by so many other countries. I think this was the time where there was also a German publication that um, uh, proposed to send a bill, or I think they did send a bill. I think also Angela Merkel also sent a bill to China, or it pronounced that China should pay for the damages incurred in the during the COVID. So that was also a conversation that we had in the Philippines. And so when we asked them, maybe 70% of the people believe that China should pay for the COVID-19 damages that the country's incurred. Um, uh, a couple of other things. We use digital sentiments to look at what people think about the Dito telecommunity and the what people think about POGO operations, which are touted as two of the most important activities of the Chinese government, or at least the China here. Of course, POGO is actually not sanctioned by Xi Jinping, and this is where Xi Jinping and President Duterte surprisingly disagree with each other. President Xi Jinping actually called on President Duterte to crack down on gambling. But this is something that we continue to do despite the warnings of Xi Jinping. I mean, contrary to what most people think. But most people believe, actually 83% of the 11,000 engagements on Facebook, that um, uh, don't agree with the resumption of POGO operations, right? So that's quite a number of disagreement, and we feel that that's also because the continuation of POGOs bred enmity among Filipinos at the time where joblessness and unemployment was highest, and I mean, continue. It's sort of a double standard and preferring other countries, other nationalities to operate in the Philippines. So Filipinos believe that maybe this is not a good idea, and that the Philippine government should prioritize the jobs of Filipinos over the jobs of from other nationalities. So I mean, you saw that kind of nationalism play up as well. And then, of course, the conversation about Dito building cells in military camps. 55% criticize the government for compromising national security. That's quite a lot, and we know that the presence of digital operators, also contribute to the sentiments here, and that's why we think that this is quite crucial that 55% of the people, at least in on Facebook, criticize the government for these types of activities, right? And only 12% defend Dito telecommunity for their activities. This was a sentiment scan that we ran in September, so that was a little bit later, towards the end of last year, and I think the continuing issue about Chinese companies here will definitely be a huge uh, agenda in the 2022 elections. So that's why China China policy of the government will definitely be appraised during the 2022 elections. It's not China is not it's not just about islands. It's also about jobs. It's also about COVID. It's also about Dito telecommunity, right? And then finally, we tried to probe what people thought about the South China Sea disputes, also based on the sentiment analysis software and methodology. So 50% criticized the past administration of the administration of Pinoy for building. I mean, for the new infrastructure of China in the South China Sea. So that was quite telling, and this is, I think, an effort of the Duterte administration to sway public opinion towards something more beneficial to them. This is also, but the sentiments regarding the Chinese embassy video, if you remember that, was actually over almost a lot of it is against China and against the Chinese government. There's still maybe people who support the China and Chinese embassy, but we know that this might be politically operated, right? So these results also reveal how much of an issue, um, uh, how much the government um, prioritizes certain issues over others, right? And where they will deploy their operators. And there was also the Gember vessel that was sinked by a Chinese ship, or the Chinese militia, or at least a member of the Chinese maybe force in the maritime sphere. 60% criticized President Duterte and the whole government for 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 what happened. So yeah. So I think maybe just to sum it up, we know, number one, that China is not a multifaceted issue. That China is a multifaceted issue, that it deals with so many things, such as jobs, such as the pandemic, not just about South China Sea. And we feel that looking at, I mean, some people say that China is low on the agenda for the elections. Maybe the South China Sea is low on the agenda, but not China. And it will take I think some of my friends already heard this. It will take an eloquent opposition to sort of reframe the public discussion, just beyond the territories, to maybe include and subsume other topics, right? The second thing is, we feel that because of the opinions about China, how the government will handle this, that might be a window into what are the sort of topics that will be talked about by the candidates. And we know that some of the candidates and conveners of certain groups have already talked about China, is already talking about China. So we know that, of course, Senator Manny Pacquiao, who's trying to position himself as a contender, either for the presidency or the vice president, or even for just higher office, has been talking about China. Just a few days ago, he responded to President Duterte, saying that he should study more about South China Sea issues and about foreign policy. That's something that's not within his expertise. And then, of course, you have the opposition, Isambayan, already talking about sovereignty in South China Sea. And I think today, because today is the Independence Day, more people will talk about sovereignty issues. Moreover, there were already some important voices in the Senate of the Philippines that have been active, trying to push for a comprehensive appraisal of Philippine foreign policy towards China. We know that there was a resolution filed by maybe 11 to 14 senators to probe President Duterte's China policy. But of course, it hasn't really moved past the committee, because the chairman of the committee is an ally of the president. That's Senator Coco Pimentel. So, but if you look at the composition of those 11 senators, most of them are softly aligned, or even in the middle of or independent, and not really in favor of President Duterte's China policy. So my point is, in revealing these results, we feel that China will be an issue. It will be an agenda, at the very least. We don't want to promise that this will be consequential for the elections, and that rather that this will change the course of foreign policy in 2022, when we have a new president in 12 months, right? But at the very least, this will be an agenda, and because public opinion also is relational, meaning that it's not just about people responding, but it's also about the campaign messages of electoral aspirants. We feel that we have to continually probe into what people think, especially when the elections are nearing, and when election season officially opens. It's officially opened by COMELEC. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garcia, for highlighting and going beyond the traditional understanding of geopolitics, and that is from the macro level or the structural level or the major power level. And you have wonderfully highlighted the role of public opinion and the domestic factors that influence foreign policy trajectory, especially in the case of the Philippines. Now, this has been indeed an enlightening session, and I thank you, all the speakers, for providing such a comprehensive and multidimensional discussion and providing presentations along with that. On this point, I wish to give the floor to our host, Ms. Abelia, for introducing our distinguished reactor, Mr. Barber, and to proceed with the next portions of the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Don, for facilitating the polylog, and to all our panel speakers for those wonderful presentations. Well, at this point, we invite our viewers to please send in your questions via our chat box. We will have an open forum later. But now, after the comprehensive presentations, of course, we now would want to hear from a futurist perspective. What is the futures of geopolitics? It is my pleasure to introduce our reactor for today. Mr. Marcus Barber has a core specialty. It is to help organizations and individuals understand and undertake strategic change. Working with executive and leadership groups, his work in identifying emerging issues and future operating conditions has been utilized by corporations, not for profit entities, and government agencies nationally and around the world. As a go to consultant supporting the City of Greater Dandenong's SEBN unit, he's advised and trained hundreds of manufacturing managers across the greater southeast of Melbourne over the past 15 years. Mr. Barber displays world class facilitation and training skills in strategy and personal development, and has designed and delivered sessions to senior personnel and operational staff in businesses and organizations across an array of industry sectors. Well, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Marcus Barber.
Thank you, Celine, and thank you, Dr. Lazan and Professor Cruz, for your invite to come and join you today. Thank you for all the wonderful speakers providing your level of expertise. Delightful to have that level of skill set as well. Mr. Gill, thank you also so far for your facilitation. To everyone listening in who's joined us, thank you for your time to join us on this little conversation around the future of geopolitics. I flagged that my specialty is not in the realm of expertise that our speakers have. They're here to provide the insights on a particular subject. My job now is to try and help provoke the kind of thinking that's available to us and what a futurist might do and what a futurist might consider. I'm going to share my screen here just to give you a bit of an idea of the map that we would use when we have a consideration of a particular topic. And you can see here, when we're thinking about things like geopolitics, there's four key questions. We want to try and look at factors that are making change happen right now. We want to seek some of the emerging potentials for change. And so that's the difference between what would we call environmental scanning, what's happening around us now, and horizon scanning. What can we see starting to emerge over the future? We saw some of the challenges and the topics raised here on things like emerging technology, different demand of the hegemonies, the United States hegemony and China. And interesting that I saw a question in the chat. We seem to have forgotten a little bit about Russia and their play on the concept of geopolitics. We're having a conversation around middle powers and how they might respond. And what was really interesting for me, and I thought quite valuable to the listener, was that recognition of the internal factors that might shape. And that's what I'm going to play around with here in this conversation. So if we think about paying attention to emerging issues, I want to flag for you two books that have recently come across my desk and things I've read through. The one on the right there, Carbon Civilization and the Energy Descent Future, is talking about the shift in demand of energy around the world away from the fossil fuel sector and towards other means of giving ourselves energy and access to the type of power we need. Importantly, it talks about the fact that we cannot switch off fossil fuels, but we will need to draw down significantly if we want to actually jump this chasm that things like environmental change are bringing to us now. And the other book there by Brenna McKay is The Dawn of Eurasia, talks about Russia's re-emergence and the connection between Asia in part of what is a hard separation. There's no clear physical boundary or geopolitical boundary, and Russia, having lost its position as one of the large hegemonies, is now trying to reassert itself. As a futurist, then, the question is, how do we look at the concept of geopolitics? Of all the factors we've had presented to us today, what we start to look for as a futurist is, what is those emerging issues of change? If you aren't studying geopolitics yourself, this framework might be quite useful. Please understand that geopolitics is not an external, out there only response mechanism. We do not respond to just external factors. As was raised from that research, the internal factors, what do we hold near and dear to us, also shape our ability or need to engage. Here I've listed some of the factors that are there. The idea of structural stability is, does the world itself, does the play internal is each country? Does each country have the structural stability? Does it have access to water, food, energy, and rule of law? If you have those things available to you, you have structural stability for your society, your country to operate well. Within that, you have players at the next level, which are what we call our people, our citizens, and the idea of social stability, equity and safety, education, housing, health, and that sense of purpose. Where do we want to go? This idea of Hiraya in the Philippines. What is it we're going to become? What is our dream and hope? How do we bring that together? And that applies to other countries as well. And then I'll list here this idea of external factors that come into play. What is the wider world calling for, or what does it offer us? Again, structural stability at the external level, the largest scale geopolitical area, looks at the idea of rule of law, international trade, representation, and the global stability. Environmental safety is starting to become a factor, people movement, nation states versus factored interests. And by that, I mean the idea of a corporate state. We look at the social media giants. Arguably, from an economy point of view, they are larger than almost every other country in the world, bar one or two. And then the real politic. How do the players go about dealing with each other? Geopolitics is a dance. It is a platform that the future says, how well does each player dance? Do we have the capabilities? The more independent you are of being able to rely on others external for you, the better you're able to position yourself geopolitically. If you have a reliance on external factors bringing their wares, their skill sets, their technology to you, the weaker you are as a player geopolitically. And this is important when we talk about things like the middle players, the Philippines, Australia to a lesser extent. How do we, squash between large hegemonies, have something to say? What is our role and how do we go about doing it? I'm going to give you some examples by way of prompt. Now, please note, these aren't predictions. These are estimations. Remember, I'm looking for internal, external signatures. When we're talking about China's century of humiliation and its three targets that Dr. Ravenna raised, we start to understand that China has a particular position it wants to influence in order to get its internal needs. And so it's going out externally to try and raise the quality of its internal lifestyle. And that's some of the concept. Mr. Pitlow spoke about, the tale of Julys, those two hegemonies that exist on the 4th of July, or July itself from China's perspective, its century. These start becoming different ways in which our values of a geopolitical entity influence others. So here's a quick snapshot. Please take in mind, this isn't a prediction. This is just me giving you an example of how you use this geopolitical futures map to assess an individual country. So I'm going to start with my home country and talk about the internal weaknesses that it has. We are the driest inhabited country on the planet, and yet we export most of our water in terms of food around the world. So water is a major factor for us in Australia. We also have weakness in energy supplies. We're still coal reliant, we're still importing oil, and even though we're undertaking the shift to renewables, the internal politics of the country is holding that transition back. And so we have an internal weakness. We also have issues and challenges over equity and safety and housing. What does that mean? It means externally, we need to try and find methods to have international trade. but we don't do international trade well because we're relying on one or two economies. And that is the commodity is, say, minerals that we send out, or beef and meats in terms of agriculture. But if we have geopolitically other countries finding access to that offering, the minerals or the foodstuffs that don't rely on Australia, we are in a serious level of stress. And so what you start to see is that Australia must play its dance in a very different way to other countries. Philippines has a different asset and different advantage. That mention of the stats of so many Filipinos under the age of 40 as a young nation really is a massive asset, because what the older nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia to a lesser extent, the aging populations, Japan as well, will be looking for skill sets that the youth have in terms of education. Now that changes the dynamic that a middle power like Philippines might have in terms of how it goes out geopolitically. We can offer the world brains and intelligence to solve problems on your behalf, and that makes the Philippines an interesting asset. Whether it has other commodities, that's for others to see. Let's quickly look at another country. Singapore. Its internal weaknesses of food and energy. It's solved its water problem, but it's still importing around 90% of its food from outside its own borders. Its energy access is also problematic because it doesn't derive enough of its energy internally as well. What we're starting to see some of the signs from across Singapore, the idea of social equity starting to be a problem. And there's conversation there, particularly with the rising youth who've been well trained and educated, wanting more say, more share, and more of the benefits. Externally, Singapore plays really well geopolitically, but the factors internally might change the way it needs to respond at a geopolitical level to get the kind of things it needs to maintain internal stability. The United States. Again, at a conference in Singapore in 2019, I posed to the experts on the stage whether the United States was in fact a failed state, given everything that it had available to it, the stresses it was under, its inability to house its own, feed its own, care for its own, the challenge it was having. Certainly, this was prior to the pandemic. Here's where I see the United States. It has issues over water access, both through drought and poisoned water supplies. Rule of law we've seen in recent times. Maybe that's going to shift. I don't know. Remember, this is just my external view. I'm not saying it is. This is an external view. We have issues over equity and safety and education in the United States. Housing and health are problematic the whole way through, and it has external weaknesses. So although it's a hegemony, the large scale of it is being very stale in terms of its ability to shift. There's a reluctance, I think, for it to adapt and mold itself to a new world order that's starting to arise, and that poses challenges for it. But it also provides opportunities for middle powers to provide access to these services that it needs internally. And you have an access point that might be able to leverage relationships geopolitically into places like the United States. So a quick summary before I get back to a couple of other points. Factors internally or externally cause movement and exchange of ideas and needs and demands. The ability to have to respond geopolitically are both internal and external. Now, if you are self-sufficient in capability, you are in a better position to negotiate your place geopolitically. I think Philippines in particular has a really strong structural position in relation to its youth and the vast amounts of money it's spending in education so far. Do you have internal problems? Yes, we know that you have energy problems, but you're moving towards solving some of those things now. But understand every individual country has internal and external factors that will challenge and influence the way it needs to negotiate. So let's talk now about some of the issues in relation to what the pandemic has done. The pandemic as a shock to the system. Now remember, the pandemic is not new. We've had experts talking about the rise of pandemics for the last 10 or 15 years. We saw with the earlier SARS viruses, we saw with the swine flu, we saw with the avian flu. We understand the concept of close contact. But what this particular pandemic has done as a shock to the system is do two main things. One, it's shown the inherent weakness in internal supply chains. Our reliance on, for instance, China in particular, as the main supplier of our goods, has suddenly created a bottleneck that therefore opens up opportunities. We are seeing countries start to consider the idea of remanufacturing onshore as opposed to reliance of importation. We see the rise of Vietnam as a possibility, also becoming a multiple player to be able to take place of China. And the second thing that started to happen is we've seen the political impotency of certain countries to deal with the issues of a pandemic. The response initially between the likes of the United States, United Kingdom, Brazil, and India as some subjects, as well as elements around other parts of the world, has seen them really challenged to be able to deal with what was required from a response point of view. Geopolitics is a dance between internal and external factors. Our subject matter experts have shown us some of the clues about how that will play out. For me, the challenge is what else can we see? How do we respond? If Philippines wants to become a middle player, what are its leverage points? Thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barber. Well, that reaction puts value in today's objective. Thank you for bringing in those perspectives and insights, as well as additional information on the pandemic issue. Your reaction is formed from the questions, from what um, I can recall. How do we look at the concepts of geopolitics and emerging issues of change? Thank you very much once again, Mr. Barber. And now I formally open the question and answer portion of today's program. So because we are a bit constrained with time, we will be entertaining only 5 questions, and we now have 4 via our chat box, and I have 1 via our Facebook Messenger. So for the first question, this is a question for Dr. Robin Garcia on his presentation. Did the answers to the questions from your survey come from the same respondents? Sir, please answer, po.
Yep. I actually didn't want to talk about the methodological concerns, but yes, it did come from the same set of respondents, of course. We ran the survey for the same period, and we designed the questions to really probe into Philippine-China relations. Right. So yes, the answer is yes.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Robin. Yes, that's the methodology part, no, of your presentation. So I hope, Miss Lara, uh, that answers your question. Okay. For the next one, this is from Yusek Revsi Escobedo. Thank you very much, Yusek, for joining us today. I will be um, reading his question. So China is seemingly the next world's largest economy, and as we see it, expanding its reach in all dimensions like economy, militarily, technology, geography, and politics. China is asserting its own map over the entire South China Sea, which is the most critical trade route in the world. Russia also has returned to the Middle East, and it's pivoting to the East for oil and gas exports. On the other hand, the US is reasserting its political hegemony over the Indo Pacific region. What are the prospects of the Philippines in the arena of international relations and diplomacy? How do we deal with China, the US, Russia, and the ASEAN neighbors? So this is a pretty challenging question, but I hope our panelists and our reactor, as well as our moderator, can jump in to answer this. So maybe anyone who would want to answer first can unmute their microphones. All right, Mr. Barber.
I'll just prompt the other speakers here. And I read an article a while ago talking about Calayan Islands as opposed to the Spratlys or the South China Sea. And I think if the Philippines want to play and maintain its position, first thing you need to do is hold a position that's your own. And so labels matter in international politics and geopolitics. Labels matter. And I think any time a Filipino politician is talking about the future of its internal relations, it needs to make sure it has a strong internal grounding, and that is the Calayan Islands, as opposed to talking about some other entity that someone else might claim is a label saying it's their own.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Barber. Mr. Don, you may.
Yes, thank you. This is actually a very interesting question. We're looking into the dynamics of China involving itself beyond its periphery, Russia involving itself in the Middle East, and the US having the Indo Pacific construct. What we have to understand is, as Mr. Barber said, there has to be a balance internally and externally for Philippine foreign policy. So internally balancing within the Philippine context would mean increasing its defense capacity, increasing economic capabilities. However, what I'd like to point out is the internal factor, which needs to be addressed in terms of understanding Philippine foreign policy. And that is what I have been actually quite vocal about has been the initiation of a trilateral between India and Japan, for example. So the India, Japan, Philippine trilateral. Why is that? India, an emerging great power, and Japan, a major regional power, are neighbors of China that have stood up to China and also are doing trade with China, engaging with China completely as well. India shares border issues with China. It is aware of the circumstances that the Philippines as well is facing. China claims 90,000 kilometers of the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, for example. Its dissatisfaction with the line of actual control, which led to the Galwan Valley clash last year. And Japan has its own issues in the East China Sea. So, what I'm suggesting is that India and Japan are able to balance into the Philippines' favor in foreign relations. India and Japan are working closely with Russia in the Far East. India and Japan are also strategic partners of the United States and are also key economic partners of China. So this would allow the Philippines enough room to create an arrangement that would be able to spearhead its strategic interests in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Don. Yes, Mr. Lucia.
Yeah, I think China is both a challenge and an opportunity. I think this phrase has been oftentimes cited. In the case of the Philippines, the South China Sea is an issue between six countries, and those countries continue to have good economic engagement with China, despite of the tempest of the South China Sea. So I think the idea of managing the dispute so that we can expand relations makes sense. But we should also not shy away from pushing back if we have to. I think Don raised the important point of capacitating ourselves. This is where our investments in modernizing our military, in our Coast Guard, our efforts to try to engage non-traditional partners like India, Russia, also China, alongside sustaining long-standing alliances with US, Australia, and of course Japan. So I think, of course, there would be rough patches. Leadership changes may affect certain priorities. Some relations may hit a snag, may be challenged. But I think on the main, we have to sustain those engagements so long as they benefit us. And if we have to display, if we have to display displeasure or disagreement with whatever certain rivals or adversaries are doing, co-claimants in the South China Sea are undertaking, then we have to.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Yes, Mr. Barber.
Just a quick observation too, from a military point of view, the key element always used to be about the ability to secure our own physical borders. What we're starting to see, though, with military issues is the rise of cyber borders. And so whether or not the military physical structure of an army or a standing air force needs to take place in much the same level as it used to, given the challenges are likely to be cyber orientated. And another thing on the idea of Kalaman Islands or the Spratlys Islands in the South China Sea, the issue over that seems to be whether or not there are natural reserves of carbon-intensive fuels in relation to oil and gas at a time when the world is moving away from carbon-intensive fuels in the form of oil and gas. So whether it holds the same financial and strategic value as it once did, I don't know. As in terms of politics and values, that's a different conversation.
Yes, Dr. Chester.
Thank you, Selena. I think we have already discussed about the relations of the Philippines to major powers like India, um, of course, um, the US and China. But we have to remember that when we talk about security, whether it be economics and politics also, we should also maintain our relations with our Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, because basically we should look at our neighbors first. What are their strengths and how did they do it? Basically, on how to challenge China and how did they succeed in terms of their economic prowess and of course their diplomatic relations also with China and the U.S. These are some of the things that we should also look at first. And secondly, there are alternatives aside from Russia and other big powers. There you have France, basically, who is trying also to engage with us. And let's try to diversify it because basically we've done it so far in this incumbent government where diversification is a key element. And I think the next president should also learn from this and continue on diversifying our relations so that we can basically uh, get together our strength and put more power on how we would engage diplomatically.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Chester. I wish to get more answers from the other panel speakers, but we have to cut the Q&A for the first question only. So now we move on to the second one. If I may, can I invite Mr. Scott Jordan, who has been with us, to ask his questions? Mr. Scott, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, oh no, that's great. The second question is just it was about what everyone's talking about right now. So if you want to look at the question in the chat box, I won't take too much time. The main question I was talking about is we're dealing with, I think one of the greater challenges we're dealing with in terms of democracies in Asia is people's perceptions. And so a lot of that is informed by media, fake news, but also there's the old stereotypes, the old, there's in the way historical grudges in this region hold up blows my mind away because in America we forget about this after about 10 years and move on. We're friends now, sort of. And so what should governments and civil servants be doing to clear this up as much as possible? Also, and I forget about the self-reflective image as well, because I know I forget who spoke about how the Philippines sees itself. This idea of being a middle power seems like such an old-fashioned sentiment, and maybe it should be incumbent upon the Philippines itself to come up with a new way of looking at itself in the world, as opposed to this. Because when you get into this high, middle, low, then you get into middle, low, middle, high. It just endlessly breaks up and turns into this nasty dichotomy. So, what are some observations you might have or possible solutions for some of these perceptual problems and how we can move forward as democracies and as people working in the governments to steer our people towards more empowered futures?
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Chester first, and then Mr. Pitlock.
Okay, that has been a problem of the Philippines because of its public image in the international community. Even if we're trying to elevate the status of the Philippines as a middle power, a lot of other countries are still doubtful of its position, whether it could carry its primordial mission and role as a middle power. Basically, the Philippines naturally became a middle power because of its attraction to achieve attention from two superpowers right now, China and the US. And basically, we've done it. And I think one of the considerations why the Philippines became an immediate middle power because of its strength in lawfare. The Hague ruling basically elevated us as a middle power, and basically because of the personality of the current leader right now, that made us truly an interesting country to study. But nonetheless, without the economic prowess of the Philippines to position itself as a middle power, most of its policy making and its ambition would be futile. So nonetheless, economics will play a major role here. And definitely, even if we try to revamp the public image of the Philippines, still the issues on corruption, poverty, are the same themes that other countries will be throwing against the Philippines. That's the reason why we need to fast track the economic development in the Philippines. And by the time that the Philippines will become the 18th largest economy in the world by 2050, that means that we will have considerable respect coming from our neighbors and from the world. And by that time, economics will play a major role on how the Philippines will definitely carve its niche in its policy making, particularly in foreign policy. And I think that would indeed position us as a respected middle power. Thank you for that.
Dr. Chester, Mr. Pitlo.
Yeah, just quick on the point about information. I think that is a very interesting point by Mr. Jordan. The information landscape is increasingly being contested. There's a lot of this proliferation of fake news, misinformation, disinformation. Some of them deliberate, some of them unintentional, but just the same, they get to spread quickly, especially with social media. Philippines being one of the most social media savvy countries, and so I think this is a concern. But regulating this would, of course, I think, wade into very difficult conversations on free speech, constraints on whether to go censorship. I think the private sector on its own, social media platforms, especially the big ones, are taking their own measures, doing fact checking to make sure that their platforms won't be used to spread hate or to spread violence, to incite crime or discrimination against certain groups, or disseminate fake or misleading information. But whether governments can step in this, I think this is a difficult territory. I think there is a need for it, but how best to proceed to it, I think there would be not a few dilemmas that would be involved. But it's something that is worth being discussed going forward.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Pitlo. Are there any other speakers who would like to answer the question? If none, I will move on. I think the questions raised via our chat box have similarities already, and you have answered some of them. I would just like to ask this one final question from Ismael Alango. Since we are talking about the role of the Philippines, what specific role can the Philippines as a middle power contribute towards sustaining peace in the region, considering the current realization that China's hegemony is manifesting in the Spratly Islands? What kind of geopolitical status will we realize in the future when other middle powers like Indonesia, Vietnam will react to this China hegemony in the contested border islands?
Okay, I'll go first because it pertains to the Philippines. The problem here is that the ASEAN centrality is being challenged right now, and the role of ASEAN as the main driver for many of the multilateral and unilateral fora would become a major would play a major role in the future. And I think the Philippines being one of the pillars of ASEAN would play a major role, given that, of course, we are very vocal about the many issues in the ASEAN problems. One would be the unresolved sea row in the South China Sea. And I think, given the ASEAN way style of deciding on things, we should try to revamp some of the values and conditionalities in ASEAN that would help us propel into a better position as ASEAN. And I think by doing that, the Philippines has an important role as a middle power to influence the ASEAN members on how to change some of the modalities in the decision making, and also the role of ASEAN, the strong role of ASEAN in the future. And by doing that, this will become a major transition, because basically we see recently in the China ASEAN meeting, we saw the upper hand of China in terms of its in terms of ASEAN's decision making in some of the three major issues right now in Southeast Asia, the Myanmar, of course, the Myanmar issue, and then of course the South China Sea problem, conundrum, and then basically about the completion of the code of conduct, which China will have an upper hand in its completion, basically because of the Belt Road Initiative and of the conditionalities that Dr. Jed mentioned about earlier about the upcoming strength of China. To cut it short, basically what the Philippines can do. The problem with the Philippines is that we don't have a unified narrative. A case in point would be the Hague ruling. We have divergent narratives. That's the reason why, as a nation state, we have not arrived. And that would be a problem when it comes to the public image and credibility of the Philippines in the future. If we have a very strong, unified narrative, regardless of who wins in the election next year, then that's a turning point for the Philippines. And our colleagues from ASEAN will definitely listen to us. And I keep on saying every time I lecture at the National Defense College and the Command and General Staff College, if you could make the armed forces of the Philippines the best defense force in ASEAN, that would be a very opportunistic narrative and achievement for the Philippines. And by that time, we could at least defend the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Philippines. And lastly, for this, we should continue dreaming bigger for the Philippines. If we could exit from becoming a low middle income country to becoming an upper middle income country, then basically we will have a large pool of middle class thinking citizens, and we will definitely elect good leaders and rule this country in a better way. And I think that would be a better legacy for the future for the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chester. Yes, Mr. Don, would you like to make a
Yes,
follow-up?
quite briefly, I agree with Dr. Cabalza. Geographically and geopolitically speaking, the Philippines is blessed with its geography. Looking at it from the Indo-Pacific construct, it is what I call the heart of the Indo-Pacific. It is the entrance to maritime Southeast Asia, and it has vital sea lines of communication in its maritime periphery. And with that, it is a central component in the great power competition between the United States and China. So the Philippines must not shy away to set its terms in order to invest in its national interest. So we have the geographical advantage. What needs to be done now is the advantage in human agency to realize that we are blessed with this geographical outlook. And talking about ASEAN, the fear of being ostracized because of the relevance of the Quad, who though administers and adheres to ASEAN centrality, and of course the rising of China, led to the establishment of the ASEAN outlook in the Indo-Pacific in order to set itself into the discussion as the driver of as a regional mechanism. However, again, at the end of the day, geography and policy should only be relevant until we fill it up with proper human agency to realize our full potential in this regional context. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Don. Indeed, it's really a work in progress still, no? And maybe our other speakers, anyone who would want to add on to this topic? Okay, if none, I would like to highlight just this question from Mr. Carl, this one from what can be done in the Philippines problem of identity politics? It seems that it affects its domestic governance and foreign policy. And I would just like to highlight this answer from Mr. Barber. He said that identity politics works in areas where people are less informed. If it's a problem, you need to better inform your public. So thank you very much, Mr. Barber. And our other speakers can still put in your responses to our chat box. So there are a lot of questions because we do have very interesting topics which you all presented. So once again, we thank you. I formally close the question and answer portion for today's program. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for being here and for being very energetic and for putting in substantive discussions Thank you very much once again. So at this point, I would now like to move on to the concluding part of today's program, which is the closing synthesis. So may I call on our very own Vice President, the Vice President of the Philippine Futures Thinking Society, the Chairman of the Association for Professional Futurists, and the Chief Futurist of the Center for Engaged Foresight, Professor Sherman Cruz.
Much, Celine. So I hope you can hear me now. Yeah, it was an amazing conversation and exchange about the future of geopolitics, at least from the perspective of the Filipino and from an ASEAN point of view. It's good to hear about the issues that are dominating the narratives, the news headlines, the mental models that we've been using, to situate ourselves, in the context of a geopolitical future. Uh, about the conversation that we've been having, several insights came to my mind, particularly on the aspect of international relations analysis and the models that it's been using. And it reminds me of the insight shared by Johan Galtung, who is considered as the father of peace studies, at the UN, when he said that the actions of nations are symptomatic of deeper historical causes and civilizational codes. We're celebrating the Independence Day today, the Philippine Independence Day. In fact, we've seen in history how our leaders, organizations, institutions struggled to gain this independence. That was back then, the shape, the narrative of international relation, to get out from the stroma and just to be free and, decide for ourselves, what future would we have for the next 100 years. In fact, Jose Rizal has a pretty deep and inviting analysis of what would the country look like 100 years from his time. And if you try to look into his essay, the Philippines a century hence, he had speculated on many possibilities of how the future of the country might look like. Now, this also leads me to the idea of what actually is the deeper civilizational dialectic as far as international relations are concerned. We have tried to analyze that from the perspective of new news headlines, data published by, of course, by our esteemed experts in international relations. But of course, there are scholars in Asia who have it's not actually unique or novel, but has been investing, to analyze the future of Asia as or nations from a civilizational point of view. And then I would like to embark from what Scott Jordan has mentioned a while ago about perception and identity. Like, how do we see ourselves, find ourselves, as Filipinos or Asians in the context of the future of global geopolitics? And I tried to look that into quickly, in a book published by Parag Kana, The Future is Asian. This is a book that I would suggest that everyone must read. He was saying that Asia is liquid. Asia is steel, open, heterogeneous, hyperlocal, reflective, wise, that's a matter of a debate, regenerative, eclectic, and perceptual, and processual as well. While that might not be unique to us, when compared to, how the West perceives us, but then Asia has to invest more on having a conversation about, developing some sort of, in fact, this is the narrative of international relations as far as the ASEAN is concerned, is to develop, not necessarily a global rules-based order of geopolitics, which is, of course, something that is pushed to us by the West, but rather, the effort to build the community of common destiny. Whatever that might be, that is currently being explored. So, from a civilizational perspective, is deep diplomacy possible? Is deep diplomacy possible? That if it's possible, then perhaps we could find a way. As Asia has always been like that, even before the pre-colonial period, that we have been able to harmonize our intentions and interests. We've been open. We've had always mutual interest, and we've always using the narrative of goodwill. And then from when building from a community of shared destiny, is it possible for Asian nations, like for example, we put the Southeast Asia into a corner, but apparently Southeast Asia is an emerging key player as far as international relations is concerned. The influence is pretty quite heavy on Asia, and it's not the other way around that US is influencing Asia, but rather Asia is influencing the US. And as been mentioned by Marcos, that okay, we might have left out the role of Russia, in the process of our conversation, but apparently, perhaps there might be an alternative future world wherein Russia could play could serve as a conduit between the West and the East. Perhaps, I don't know. That could be an emerging issue. And then perhaps what about the Persian Gulf? The Middle East. I haven't heard about that. Perhaps it might have come out from our analysis, but apparently the Persian Gulf is anchoring itself to be some sort of an Asian anchor to the West, which we've seen that in the past, and that could also re-emerge. So there are perhaps some forgotten corners in Asia that has been mentioned by Marcos, and of course we've been pretty heavy on, as if U.S. and China is the one actually like influencing primarily the future of Asian international relations or global politics. But Asia doesn't it acknowledges it, but it doesn't want to have a narrative wherein U.S. and China are dominating Asia. There's so much diversity in Asia, and we apparently, ASEAN is trying to trying to find a greater role on how to impact and influence the future of Asia, and particularly that will definitely influence the future of the Philippines. Another immediate emerging issue, which is I've seen just now, is quantum technologies. Right, I've seen in a report by Australia that this is something that we need to look into. It could be a game changer in global politics or geopolitics, the emergence of quantum technology, because this definitely will signal a major new policy on as we focus on science and technology and quantum technologies like robotics, AI, big data, cloud computing. We all know those kinds of stuff, and who dominates that would create a new type of leadership, which what Australia said as quantum type of leadership as far as geopolitics is concerned. There are a lot of things that we need to talk about. We don't predict the future; we anticipate it. Again, thank you very much. It was a good conversation, and the Philippine Futures Thinking Society would like to thank every one of you, and we would like to continue the conversation. And the strategic foresight this is something that we need to look into, and perhaps we can include that in our tools and approaches in our analyzing the future of geopolitics. Hiraya Manawari.
Thank you very much, Professor Sherman, for harmonizing today's discussion on the futures of geopolitics. As what you said, we can't predict the future, but we can only anticipate. So, the geopolitical outlook of our speakers really brought in a lot of issues and areas to ponder on. Nevertheless, there are existing and rising interests in geopolitical factors, the power play in Southeast Asia, the allied countries, the great powers, middle powers, the elections, the role of the Philippines, which is very timely, and the list goes on. While having a futures thinking mindset might determine the next steps. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. To extend our gratitude to our speakers, we do this all the time. On behalf of the Phil Futures, allow me to award the Certificate of Appreciation. All right. So first, let me read the certificate. The certificate of appreciation is awarded to the name of the speaker for sharing his time and expertise as a reactor, as a panel speaker, and as moderator for the Futures of Geopolitics, given this 12th day of June 2021 at 10 a.m. Philippine Standard Time via Zoom, signed by our President, Dr. Lizan Perante Calina, and Vice President, Professor Sherman Cruz. So for the first certificate, thank you, Mr. Marcus Barber, for being our reactor. For the second one, thank you very much, Dr. Chester Cabalza, for being our panel speaker. To Dr. Robin Michael Garcia, thank you, sir. To Dr. Aaron Jed Rabena, thank you very much. And to Professor Lucio Blanco Pitlo III, thank you for joining us. And of course, as our moderator, thank you, Mr. Don McLean Hill. So we will be sending these certificates to you via email. So thank you once again for joining us. We have another event today, this afternoon, on the seminar on the state of the future index and the real-time Delphi method. So watch out for that. The fiesta, of course, continues. And of course, I would like to greet everyone a happy Independence Day once again. We have to enjoy the rest of our Saturday, and I'm sure you learned so much as we did as organizers. And we do invite you to our next events. We have a lot in store. Of course, we have our main event on June 19, and also a lot of events until July 2. So that's the whole month of Fiesta. So I would now like to invite everyone to our photo gallery session. Of course, we wouldn't want to miss this photo opportunity with all our speakers and our viewers. So I hope everyone can turn on their cameras. I know it's lunchtime, but thank you still for being here with us until this time. Okay. So I will wait for the other
Yeah, and while you're opening your video cameras, I'd like to request Nicole to kindly play our fiesta music.
Fiesta song.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for spending your time with us. And we would like also to invite you all to be part of Philippine Teachers Thinking Society. It's a professional organization. So you can be a member. And being a member, you can continue your capacity development training programs on Features Thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Liz. And Dr. Lizan also sent details of our course offering at the DAP Graduate School. All right, so maybe we can now head on to our photo session. On my count po. 1, 2, 3, smile. For the second page. All right. That's our fiesta song. Thank you, everyone. A round of applause for everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Marcos, Don, Dr. Chester.
Thank you.
Lucio.
Thank you po. Maraming salamat.
Thank you po.